Hey, what's up, everybody? Hope everyone's doing well. Little belly, little feed the tree, just to kind of set the tone a bit. So, this episode is going to be talking about who was the greatest lead singer of a band or group during the 90s. And I had the question up on Instagram, and it was great to see so many different people kind of give a lot of their input as to who they felt was the greatest. Because let's face it, it's one of those things. It's one of those things that one of those questions that is extremely hard to answer. If this was, the only analogy I can make to it is kind of like basketball, with the argument is who's the greatest basketball player of all time, which is a very arguable type of question because you have to take into consideration the many different aspects of the game, of course, and you have to take in the way the game has changed over the years, the many different wonderful players who've played it, and the time we're living in, the time that used to be. And then you have to kind of feel around and see, how can we do that? How can we even make this argument? Can we make that argument? Can we have this conversation in a logical way and find a happy medium, or a list of people, a list of players that goes according to the way that who feels. And obviously, it's always the same thing. You have your Michael Jordan, you have your Kobe Bryant, and then the argument is always LeBron James. But here's my problem, and again, I'm just using basketball as an analogy. My problem is that if I'm going to do that, to do that with who's the best lead singer during the 90s, the problem is, like, when it comes to basketball, is how much the game has changed. And you could also bring into the fact that it's sort of like football. Who's the greatest quarterback of all time? The argument always goes back and forth between Tom Brady and Joe Montana. And the problem with football and basketball is the sport itself. The rules itself have changed. In football, you no longer can touch the quarterback. You can't sneeze on him. You can't fart on him without having a flag thrown. Same thing in basketball, where you can't hand check anymore, and the game has changed. They have defensive 3 seconds, and everything's a 3-pointer from you can shoot it from Alaska. So it's a very hard to have this conversation. However, that being said, I think that there is a logical way to do things. And I think that when it comes to music, what we have to remember, as music lovers ourselves and as fans of all these different types of bands, is that we have to remember, of course, the time we're talking about. And we're talking about strictly the 90s. So from 1990 to 2000. Now, in that range of time, there were bands that took off and were just doing huge things. And of course, we're talking about Nirvana, we're talking about Soundgarden, we're talking about Pearl Jam, we're talking about Stone Temple Pilots, the standards, Alice in Chains. There are so many more that we can mention, but there are also bands that crossed over during that time from who did a lot of damage in the 90s, who were coming from different times. And a lot of them, such as Metallica, who was a metal band who had a lot of hits in the 80s. They crossed over wonderfully into the into the 90s. Metallica had a large amount of hits in the 90s, and the same thing with Guns N' Roses. They crossed over from the 80s to the 90s and had a large amount of hits in the 90s. So there's Ozzy Osbourne, there's Lemmy from Motorhead, guys who have been around even past the 80s, who were around in the 70s, even maybe the late 60s for Ozzy. And they crossed over and they had hits that were well into the 90s. So we have to have this conversation, and we have to put things in certain categories. We have to bring certain things into we have to consider a lot of things. And I think that there's a way for us to do it, in that we can talk about breaking up the various lead singers and performers into certain categories. And I think when you do that, you can have a better picture of who it is that you want to be number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. And of course, I think in all things that there's always going to be those standard group of people, performers, artists that you're going to have in the categories. And of course, since we're just talking about the 90s, like I said, we mentioned a lot of the standard people for that time. Well, we mentioned the bands, and the lead singers we're talking about, of course, is Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, and Chris Cornell, and Scott Weiland, and Lane Staley, and of course, there's so many more. There's so many more. I mean, again, just from looking at the posts I've seen on Instagram, the wonderful amount of people who have everyone has their opinion. And that's the thing about this. It's an opinionated topic. Everybody's going to have their opinion. And again, it could be something. There are people who love, I don't know, look, some people think, give me a band who Rivers Cuomo is the greatest lead singer of all time. I fucking hate Weezer, man. Fuck Weezer. I don't listen to that shit. But listen, if you listen to that and you dig it and you think he's the greatest lead singer of all time, God bless you. That's up to your opinion. However, that being said, how do we compare that to certain other people? And I think the only way to do that, of course, is to kind of name a couple different categories and bring them into certain things and kind of break everybody down and then kind of look at everything from a bird's eye view, from a whole. I think it's the only logical way to do it. And the only way we're actually going to get like some type of answer with it. And that being said, it's hard to do it from my point of view too, because I'm biased in the sense that I have my favorites. I have my favorites. So I can say who I liked, who I consider to be the greatest lead singer, the greatest front person, the greatest front man of that time. Some people may not agree with me. And just going through the post that I see, I mean, let's just go from the beginning. I mean, one of the original posts was we had Scott Weiland, of Stone Temple Pilots, of Velvet Revolver, and then there was Lane Staley, Mad Season, Alice in Chains, Chris Cornell, Soundgarden, Temple of the Dog, Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam, Temple of the Dog, Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses, Peter Steele from Type O Negative, from Carnivore, James Hetfield from Metallica, Anthony Kiedis from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Courtney Love of Hole. Okay, that's just to name one group. And then in the second group, Billy Corrigan of Smashing Pumpkins, Shirley Manson of Garbage, Billy Joe Armstrong of Green Day, Maynard James Keenan of Tool, of Perfect Circle, Pussifier, Trent Reznor, Nine Inch Nails, Zach De La Rocha of Rage Against the Machine, Gwen Stefani, and No Doubt. Hey, look, man, there's people that feel she's the greatest lead singer of all time. They had a huge following in the 90s. Steven Tyler, Aerosmith, another person who crossed over from the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, because Aerosmith had a huge influence on the 90s. They had a shitload of hits in the 90s, man. A shitload. And then Dave Grohl of Foo Fighters. Ed Kowalczyk, if I'm even messing his name up, from Live, another phenomenal lead singer, phenomenal voice. Michael Stipe of REM. Now, there's a perfect example. I'm not an REM fan, never was. I can appreciate a couple of their songs, but him as a lead singer compared to the other people we mentioned, no. But hey, look, that's just me. But people feel different. People are going to feel different about that. Dolores O'Riordan from the Cranberries. Adam Derwitz from the Counting Crows. Liam Gallagher from Oasis. Phil Anselmo from Pantera. Bono from U2, another good example of a group that crossed over from the 80s, was bigger than huge in the 80s, and had some hits, had some luck in the 90s. Perry Farrell from Jane's Addiction, Porno for Pyros. Jonathan Davis of Korn. Gavin Rosedale of Bush. Ed Roland of Collective Soul. We said Lemmy. Ozzy Osbourne. Sully Erna from Godsmack. Okay, and Tom York from Radiohead, and I think you could even put more people in there. There were so many others that you could put in there. I think because there were so many people that had Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Tom Petty had a lot of hits in the '90s, even as a solo artist, even or with a backup band or as part of the Heartbreakers. He had a lot of hits. So that being said, the question is, who was the greatest? Who was the greatest? Well, let's talk about certain categories that we can break these singers down into. There's vocal talent, their voice range. There's showmanship. When showmanship, I mean being the lead singer, dancing and moving, being creative, being artistic in your singing. There's musical talents, musical abilities other than singing, maybe guitar playing, piano playing, instruments, or whatever the case may be. Um, longevity, something we forget about. How many lead singers and they're are able to cross over, like we said, from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s and up. One person I'm thinking about is the great Mick Jagger. Okay, there's a guy a perfect example of longevity. So these are the categories we break these lead singers into. Also, too, what was the overall effect this lead singer had on the time? Or did they surpass the 90s in the effect they had? And so many of them have. Let's face it. So many of them have. I mean, we're talking about people that who will be talked about forever when it comes to music, and should be for that matter. And again, I think that really goes with the standard group of performers that I've mentioned before. In the Chris Cornell, Scott Weiland, Lane Staley, all those guys. When it comes to the narrative, what I mean is the narrative of the time was, we automatically know what what happened with that. And again, like I've said in the earlier podcast, the narrative of the time was to kind of group all these new bands into a bowl and kind of just say, well, this is what grunge is. Well, that's a bunch of bullshit, man. Because a lot of those bands were doing things way before they got into the spotlight, or they fit the narrative, or whoever those people are that kind of try and coin these silly names or whatever, or put these bands in a bowl, were able, they were doing things before that. These singers were still putting out a lot of good material. And the funny thing that we see so many times is, it's until they hit the spotlight with either a song or an album that we then see their back catalog of music we didn't know about. And I think a perfect example of that is Nirvana. If you didn't know about Nirvana before Nevermind, you would have never known about Bleach, which is really funny, And again, I think there were a lot of people who weren't too familiar with them until Nevermind came out. And again, that may have been, to some extent understandable, because some people just they don't delve into it that much, and then it's a good and bad thing. But once they get a band or a singer gets on the spotlight, it gives the listener the ability to go back and kind of you know kind of look deeper into things that they may not have known about. And I think they're a perfect example of that. And you know obviously, we all know that Nevermind put them on the map, but Bleach was before that. Bleach, and I said this in the last podcast. Bleach was such a great album. Bleach was more or less an underground album. And if you listen to that album, I think you'll hear the core roots from where Nirvana is coming from. That voice, that sound that they had. It wasn't toned. It wasn't primed. It wasn't pretty. It was what it was. Nevermind, as genius of an album as it is, I think was more kind of primed up, as was In Utero, another genius album. But that's the thing about this is, the great thing about the 90s was that a lot of these lead singers and bands were getting noticed, thank God, and it was long overdue for whatever reason. But they've been in the game for a long time. So again, to kind of be objective, let's be objective with this. Let's take away from the fact that you and I, we have our favorites, we know that, but let's just think about this. So let's talk about a category that we can, one of the first categories, and let's just say vocal talent. Okay. Obviously, I mean, in just pure vocal talent, pure voice, pure just being able to kind of hit the highs, hit the lows, hit long notes. We know what we're all going to say is the mighty, mighty great late Chris Cornell, probably one of the greatest voices ever. Chris Cornell had one of the greatest voices ever, hands down. And it eclipsed the 90s. It went all the way up until the point, where he passed. And again, if you really wanted to appreciate a band or a singer, obviously I always say to go see them live. I had the joy, the privilege, the luck, the blessing of getting to see not only Soundgarden, but I got to see Chris Cornell live in person by himself, where he broke the show up into a couple of different parts, where he was doing some acoustic, some non-acoustic. The man's voice was angelic, was just angelic. It transcended everything. And again, we've seen him be able to sing in so many different genres of music. I mean, we've heard him sing "Nothing." Sinead O'Connor's "Nothing Compares to You," which was originally written by Prince, and then we've seen him sing, songs from that opened movies like Casino Royale. You Know My Name, and we've seen him sing different versions of music, more metal, more heavier stuff. The guy was I mean, in a class by himself. So he's in that group of pure voice. But in the pure voice vocal talent, there's a lot of other guys that may not have had the reach that he had in voice, but had another category is unique voices, unique talent. But since we're just talking about one right now, let's stick to just pure vocal talent and pure just having a phenomenal voice at the time, or just a phenomenal voice overall. He's the first guy you're going to think of all the time. um if we're I think if we're talking, if we change the channel and go to unique voices, Lane Staley is there. Lane Staley had a voice that you could never, I don't think you can ever really duplicate. It was haunting, it was dark, it was interesting, it was phenomenal for the sound of the band of Alice in Chains and Mad Season. It was a unique standalone type of voice that I don't think we'll ever hear again. It was its own brand, and that's extremely rare. I think that's extremely rare to have, again, another lead singer who I don't think gets his due from another band that doesn't get their due. you know and if we're talking about unique voices as well, I think you have to put other people in there. You have to put Axl Rose in there too. He had that kind of, that, I don't know what the word would be. It was that kind of twiny type voice that was, he was able to go very high. And Axl Rose is interesting because I think he fits into a couple different categories. He fits into that category, but he also fits into the longevity category. I saw Alice in Chains 2-3 years ago, back-to-back shows. They were phenomenal. Now maybe his voice has changed a little bit, and I don't know. Whatever you want to say about his voice is opinionated, but I thought they sounded great. But he goes into that category as well. He also goes into the category of a guy who came from a time and crossed over from, like I said before, the 80s to the 90s. So unique, a guy who can fill all those categories. He also can play the piano. Let's face it. So he's musically talented there. And he used to be able. I mean, he again. I don't ever like to say used to be able. I'm not trying to throw shade on, or make fun of anybody. I'm just trying to point out things that objectively. He also, I guess, back in the day when he was younger, he was performing, in physically more. with the dancing and everything. Although I'll tell you the truth, for a guy who's 60 years old, when I saw him, he was moving around a lot. He must have had like 3 or 4 costume changes during the show, and he was hustling and bustling all over the stage. And they must have done 30 songs back to back to back, plus the encore. So he's definitely in that group as well. And if you want to talk, vocal talent, if you want to talk crossing over, if you want to talk longevity, we'll put Steven Tyler in there too. Steven Tyler fits into all those categories. Great voice, able to hit those high notes, from a band that crossed from the late 60s into the late 70s or the 70s into the 80s, into the 90s. You don't really hear from them as much anymore, but he crossed over. And again, he had his own little style with the scarf around the with the microphone and everything. So I think that he had the style. James Hetfield, crossing over from the 80s to the 90s. He's in there. He's in the longevity category. He's in the guitarist category. He can play an instrument. Super talented guy. Multi-talented, right? I mean, they're still pumping out content. They're still selling out when they do their concerts. And the good thing about Metallica is we've seen them experiment a lot. They experimented with Lou Reed and did that wonderful album called Lulu, which was a phenomenal album. I don't think it got its due at all. So we've seen a band, not only, or I should say, we've seen the lead singer from a band, along with the band, cross over from a certain time, be very relevant in the 90s, and then move on to different times and have longevity. So he's in that group too. We group him in there. Let's talk Scott Weiland for a second, the late great Scott Weiland. I think Weiland you can put into a lot of different categories. Unique voice. You definitely heard the changes in his voice as time went on. It started off that low, kind of raspy, just, I don't want to use the word grungy, but a voice that, again, changed over time. And then we got to see how he could change with the music. And in the later work, it seemed like his voice got actually kind of higher pitched. Even in interviews, if you notice, when you see him talk, his voice changed. The vocal tone of his voice actually got loud, a little higher. The pitch got higher. So he's in there for unique voice. He sure shit is in there for being a front man in performance, because like I've said before, he had a lot of Iggy Pop, a lot of David Bowie, a lot of Jim Morrison built right into him. A little, just he had that in there. Even a little Mick Jagger, because again, he was a great dancer. He had some phenomenal moves when you saw him perform. I've seen him do a couple of costume changes where he came out, like I said, in a whole silver suit once. I saw him all dressed in black. I saw him shirtless. You saw him with those funky hats on. He came out with the megaphone. And even when he was a Velvet Revolver, he totally changed. Look, he had the spiky red hair. So he's another guy. Sometimes he had a blonde mohawk. He was always changing his appearance. So he's in the category of vocal talent, different type of voice, frontman, showmanship. I'm not sure how much of a musician he was in terms of playing an instrument. He may or may not have played guitar. I could be wrong. But Weiland, had he would have survived, like Chris, like some of the other people we mentioned, he could sing anything. He had the Christmas album. I've heard him sing. What's that song? He sings the church song. I go before you always. Come follow me, and I shall give you rest. It's amazing. I think on for the most part, for a lot of the albums that the Pilots put out, for a lot of the albums that Weiland was for a lot of the work that he was involved in, you heard his voice change all the time. Total frontman, total owned his own style. Totally owned his own style. Getting back to Cornell too. Cornell was a guitar player. So he now goes into a different category too of being able to play an instrument. Let's talk Eddie Vedder for a second. Eddie Vedder from, Mother Love Bone, Mookie Blaylock, Temple, the Dog, and from, of course, Pearl Jam. Well, we could fit Eddie Vedder into a bunch of different categories. A unique voice. At that time, if you listen to 10 and just kind of flash back to the time that this was coming out, and Eddie Vedder had his own had a very different sound. Okay, as did the band. And to be fair, I felt that 10 is by far their best album. Of course, I like the first three albums, 10, Verse, and Corduroy. I feel kind of all go with each other. The later work I didn't care for as much. That's just my opinion. It's not a diss on Pearl Jam or anything. The sound really changed. The band, and I guess that they were trying to grow as a band too. I could be wrong. You have to ask a really hardcore Pearl Jam fan, which I am not. So I am really not well versed in too as much stuff as a hardcore fan is. But I've seen them only live in concert on TV. I've never was able to be there. Something I definitely would love to do. But he sounds great live. That's another thing, man. How do these lead singers sound live? Well, Weiland sounded great live. Cornell was amazing live. I told you about Axl Rose live. For the most part, they a good amount of them sound great live. Sometimes you go to see them live and either they're not on, maybe they've sung the night before. So I don't really want to put the live singing thing in there because, again, there are so many different things that we have to consider for that. How many nights on? How many nights off? Are they a little nicked up in the throat? Are they sick? The play. Sometimes the venue's not the best to see them in. The sound system, whatever the case may be. So I don't even want to go into that whole category. But getting back to Eddie Vedder. Eddie Vedder is someone we can put in the longevity category, right? We saw him cross over from the 80s to the 90s and up. They're still relevant, still going strong. We've seen him have a solo career. He's put out a whole bunch of solo albums, right? He single-handedly did all the music to that movie Into the Wild, which is a phenomenal soundtrack. We know he can play. He can play the guitar. He can play the ukulele pretty damn good too. I think as a lead singer in terms of showmanship, in terms of dancing, we don't see when he came on the scene, man, he was jumping. Remember that? He was jumping into the stands. He was climbing up on the microphone thing, jumping into the crowds. Obviously, he's not doing that anymore because he's, I never say the word older. He's a different person, but he was a firecracker when he came out. So he's in all those categories. Again, longevity, crossover, instrumental. He's in all those categories. And again, I think that core group of 90s, I'll say the standard 90s singers. When we say standards, of course, my mind at least automatically goes back to the Seattle thing. But we have to consider outside the Seattle thing. Of course, outside being the Seattle thing is obviously Stone Temple Pilots and other groups that we have to consider. Since we're talking Seattle and we're talking 90s, let's talk Kurt Cobain. One of the most unique voices at the time for sure. Another, I think it's kind of similar to that raspy kind of unpolished type voice that you could really appreciate because it came from the soul. And I wonder, had he been alive today, what he would have sounded like. Because I think his voice was something kind of hard to keep up with, that raspy sound. I don't know how. I'm not a singer and I'm not a vocal coach, nor am I a doctor. So I'm sure that a lot of that singing that he did with the high-pitched screaming and whatnot definitely did damage to his vocal cords, or could have done damage to his vocal cords during that time. So I wonder, in terms of longevity, how he would have sounded today. But he's definitely in the category of unique voices. He's in the category of playing the guitar. We knew he was a very good or a decent guitar player. It's funny. I saw a list once, not to get off track, but I have to mention this, of the greatest guitar players of all time, and he was ranked pretty high. I thought that was a little strange because I think there was a lot better guitar players than he was. But I just wanted to mention that. But he could play the guitar, and he had a unique voice. As a front man in terms of, performance, showmanship, I think early on in the day, he too was one of those guys who, they wrecked the stage. But he never was really a dancer. He never was one to kind of change appearances during a show. He was kind of, I think, just set in the way he performed. And again, that's not a bad thing. That's everybody's got the difference. But he fits into various categories. So we've got those standard people, and the good thing is they're in they can stretch out among the categories. And I think that is how you have to consider your favorite lead singer. Do they touch all these boxes? And again, they may not rank as high in certain categories as others, but I think if they're relevant in those categories, it really means something. I'm gonna put somebody out there because I think he was, in my opinion, he's one of my favorite lead singers of all time, one of my favorite musicians of all time, from my favorite band of all time, Peter Steele, from Type O Negative, from Carnivore. Unique voice, big time. There's never been a voice like Peter Steele's before. In fact, I think that if you were to close your eyes and not know what Peter Steele looked like, and you heard his voice, you would have to wonder what he really looked like in real life. And then when you saw him, you'd say, "Oh wow." Maybe it kind of fits to you, maybe it doesn't, but because he was a giant of a guy. Unique voices can be haunting voice, yet very, very melodic, it grabbed you. I remember I would play a couple of tunes for people who didn't know anything about Type O Negative, and they said the first thing that got me with him was his voice. It drew people in. Sometimes it frightened people, but it still drew them in. And I think his voice, much like Lane Staley's, was very haunting and was perfect for the sound of the band. That's everything. And that's what made it unique. Instrumental, very. Peter was a great, great, great bass player. A great bass player. Longevity, yeah, pretty much until he passed away in 2007. He had crossed over from the 80s to the 90s and up in several different bands, like we said, or several different versions of a band, because, there was Carnivore, like I said, and then there was Type O Negative. But before that, I think, what was it? Type O Negative they were actually Repulsion or something like that. Or I think it was Carnivore, then Repulsion, then Type O Negative. I could be wrong. But again, he crossed over. And again, a guy who crossed over from at first, if you, when you hear him in Carnivore, it's very hard. It's very metalish, very, very 80s metal. Again, now I'm doing it with the narrative. It's metal, and which is funny because if you've ever heard, the other band was Fallout. Excuse me. When they were in Fallout, when he was in Fallout, lead singer of Fallout, and they had that song "Rock Hard," I believe it's called. It sounded like an '80s band, and his voice kind of sounded the same. That's one of the things I kind of loved about him was his voice never really changed, and that was a good thing. It never lost what it was, and he could go high at times. Again, guy I saw live, every time they were live, they were lights out. So again, he's in all those categories. They crossed over. They lasted the lengths of time. They would have kept on going had he not would have died at the young age of 47. It was his birthday not too long ago. So I'm putting him in there too, because to me, again, we're not. I don't think we have a winner. I just think we have to look at what all these different people at the time, and kind of just feel out where they fit. And it's never really hard to do. It's never really easy to do, I should say. but we have to. Then there's Anthony Kiedis, right? Definitely a unique voice. He's definitely, no one sounds like Anthony Kiedis. That funky kind of bluesy, kind of punkish type of thing. Because again, I think his voice again was a perfect sound for their band. A band that is ultra talented that could do so many different things, whether it was punk blues, something a little sped up, something a little slowed down. He's in several different categories. I'm not sure if can play an instrument or is very instrumental, but longevity, man. They He's been around for a bit. He's been around for a bit. What, late 70s maybe? I'm stretching it a little bit. We'll say early 80s and up, 90s and moving on. I mean, he's a guy that never seems to get old. He looks better and better every time you see him. So he's in the longevity. He's in the crossover category. He's in the unique voice category. And Showman, man, I never had the pleasure of seeing them live, but come on. I'm thinking light bulbs on the head from Woodstock, but I'm also thinking about him dancing around the stage. I mean, even from that, I forgot what Super Bowl it was. I think it was the Broncos versus the Seahawks when they performed in a dual manner with Bruno Mars, and they did Give It Away, and he was in his 50s dancing around the stage in tremendous shape. So he's in Showman too. He's in those different categories, we have to consider that. Courtney Love. Someone had said to me, "Why do you have Courtney Love on that list?" And I said, "How can you not have Courtney Love on that list?" To me, I think that she was an innovator for all female lead singers during the 90s. Of course, that there had been other female lead singers and other female singers before that, but I think that she was one of the first to come forward and show that a lead singer can be female, can play the guitar, and can have a kick-ass voice with a kick-ass band and just blow the doors off shit. Because I think that they were a perfect group for that time. She was a perfect example of that time. She fit the mold. And again, unique voice, right? She's in that category. She could play the guitar in that category. Showman, I never saw them live. Of course, I have seen the videos of her jumping into the fans and whatnot. I don't think she does that anymore. So I don't know, as well as that. But um, she had her own style, unique voice, longevity. She's in there because they've been going long, although Hole's no longer together, unfortunately. But she's still going. And again, I think, like I said, she was an innovator for all female groups at that time, all female lead singer. So she fills a lot of those categories as well, which is always a good thing. And then we move on to a whole bunch of other ones, right? Let's talk Billy Corrigan for a second. I heard an interview with Billy Corrigan on Joe Rogan. I heard an interview with Billy Corrigan on Howard Stern and somewhere else. An extremely cerebral, smart guy who not only knows the music business, but knows music in general. He's almost like a true connoisseur / artist because the guy writes loads of material. He's written loads of material for several different artists. He can play instruments. We know that. He's in the category of longevity, going from late 80s, early, the 90s, all the way up till now, still performing with the Smashing Pumpkins. I'm not sure if it's the same band, although I don't think it is, right? They're not all together, although I think he's back with James Iha, and I'm not sure about everybody else, but he's in that category too. I wouldn't put him as like the like a style showman, dancing, changing outfits type thing. He definitely not. He's not there. Not that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying. I don't think he's in that type of category. But I think you have to consider him extremely important figure during this time because of his ability to pump out so much material. I mean, look at the large amounts of stuff he put out there uh, in terms of albums and songs and all the songs he's written. I mean, it's a large amount of stuff. There are people who feel Billy Corgan is the greatest lead singer of that time. Shirley Manson from Garbage, which was very interesting too. Unique voice by far. No one had a voice like Shirley Manson. It just again a voice that fit the sound of the band. It was a voice and a sound that fit the time, similar to Courtney Love's. If we're going to talk female lead singers, and it's hard too. She was another one who was so important for the time for lead singers, for female lead singers, I should say. I never saw them live, although great, like a great and unique voice. Not sure if she can play an instrument. Um, I've seen them perform on the MTV Awards back in the day. Uh, I guess she had her own little style going on. I don't know if dancing, doing all that stuff, changing outfits, but great voice for the time. Great voice for the time. Moving on, Billy Joe Armstrong. Hey, look, man, people feel he's the greatest lead singer of all time. You got to give the guy a hell load of a credit. Um, Punk band, right? Humongous success in the 90s, um, 94, 95, and everything. They went huge. They went to Broadway. So we know he could sing, had his own little style. Again, a perfect voice that fit the band, that all fit together. Can play an instrument, right? Plays the guitar. Has a lot of hand in the music. I'm not. Are they? I don't even know. Are they doing anything anymore? I'm not even really sure. I haven't heard anything. But I think they've put out new content, so you could put them in the longevity group, right? You can put them in there. So we have to consider that. Um, Maynard James Keenan, definitely in the category of unique voice. There's not a human being on this planet that sounds like Maynard James Keenan when he sings. A tremendous talent. I think that group Tool, similar to Alice in Chains, had put out a sound that had not been heard at that time and stood alone. Nothing sounded like Tool. And no one sounded like Maynard James Keenan. Never saw him live, seen videos of him live. Used to, again, showman, big time. Come out with all those crazy outfits, the crazy wigs and stuff like that. Still to this day, they're still performing. I think I had heard that. I heard him on a podcast, the Joe Rogan podcast. They had put out an album that they recorded in Arizona that you could actually download or pay per view, whatever, where they had a whole set. You talk about a guy, he's got 3 different bands going on at once. I'm not sure if he can play an instrument. I've never seen him play the guitar, but very cerebral guy. Other than music, I mean, he's got a wide list of other interests, right? He's got his own winery, he's got his own pizzeria, his own bakery. Very, very intelligent and cerebral guy. Very similar to Billy Corrigan in that matter. They're very cerebral, which is so amazing to listen to, and you can appreciate it. Very so artistic and so smart. He's in that category for sure. Okay, like we said, longevity, unique voice, um, showmanship, definitely in there. Trent Reznor. I don't know if they're really performing anymore because Trent Reznor basically was Nine Inch Nails. I don't really know. I think he's still performing. I know he's scoring a lot of music for movies now. But put Trent Reznor in the category of unique voice by far. Nothing on this planet ever sounded like Nine Inch Nails in him. That in what they call it, industrial metal, industrial rock. Well, whatever that is, yeah, no one sounded like him. Uh, Very cerebral guy, had a big hand in all the music, right? The recording process. I think he played the what is it, the organ or the piano or whatever. So I'm not sure if he played anything else. Um, Again, I haven't seen them perform in a long. I don't know if they're still performing, but he I think he's up there. He fills into a different couple of categories, right? Everybody remembers how wonderful they were at Woodstock 94. That tremendous and amazing performance. Zach De La Roca. Zach De La Rocha, another guy who fits into the category of unique voice. Never heard anything like that. A rappish like sound with metal. You know, a very powerful voice. A very a voice filled with anger and messages and fire. Again, another voice that fit the sound of that band. Perfect combination. Hence be why they had so much luck. Um, don't know if he could play an instrument. As a showman, he used to dance all around, right? He could definitely go with the music. He wasn't one to change outfits and do all that stuff, but he always had a message when he was singing. Every song had a message that they did. Longevity, that's the unfortunate thing. They didn't last long. Although I know that they're back together. This concert here in New York has been postponed due to COVID in Madison Square Garden for 2 years now. So, but I don't know if they're together. I think it should just be maybe they're coming together for a certain amount of time or whatnot. So the longevity, unfortunately, isn't there because once they broke up, you didn't hear much from him anymore, and the rest of Rage Against the Machine went on to go and join Chris Cornell on what became Audioslave, but definitely unique for the time. Gwen Stefani, again, phenomenal voice, phenomenal style, goes into that category with Courtney Love of being an innovator for female lead singers at the time. A perfect voice for the sounding of that band. Whether you're a fan or not, you have to appreciate it. Longevity, I haven't really heard them. I don't think they're together anymore. I don't think she performs anymore. I know she had the solo career, and then she was on the TV show. She was married to Gavin Rossdale for a while. Don't think she's married to him anymore. She's married to somebody else. I don't know. I don't follow all that bullshit. But performer, was a great dancer, right? She used to come out and dance all over the place. Vocal talent. Don't think she could play an instrument. Never really knew that she could or heard she could. But she fills certain categories. And then we move on to Dave Grohl, which is a very interesting story. You talk about a guy that can play instruments. Lead drummer for Nirvana, guitar player for Foo Fighters. Very good lead singer, very good voice. Longevity is there. They came from the late 80s to the 90s. They're all the way up until now. He's killing it. Innovator in that he's very cerebral and has a hand in the written music, obviously. As much as a showman for a frontman, I don't know him to kind of dance around, change the outfits, kind of the Mick Jagger thing, costumes. Don't know for that. I've never seen them live, but there are people that feel that they're in there. Ed Kolowalchuk from Live, unique voice. Never heard a voice like that before. Let's face it, Live killed it in the 90s. His voice was very angelic, very melodic, reached a great amount of highs. Again, perfect for the band, perfect for the sound. Could play the guitar, had a hand in writing the music. As a showman, I never saw them live, unfortunately, although I know he was very energetic and active in the music. I've seen a lot of live concerts, in videos and stuff. And again, at Woodstock 94, he was very into it. Great, great, great talent, man. Michael Stipe, again, I'm not a fan of REM. Never was. I just wasn't my cup of tea, although I do appreciate a couple of their songs. But listen, I'm not sure if he was could play an instrument. Maybe the guitar. I don't know. I could be wrong there. Didn't seem to be one to really be a showman, changing of the outfits, dancing around the stage, and all that stuff. I think he was a very cerebral guy who kind of knew exactly the messages that the band wanted to get out. Had a hand in the songwriting process, obviously, and the overall vision of the band. And they were extremely huge during the 90s. I mean, losing my religion. They had one of the biggest albums, one of the biggest songs, and they had so many different sides. If you ask me, the work I love from them the most is Drive, obviously, Man on the Moon. Okay, two wonderful songs. But again, I think that they were on their way. He was on his way for longevity. I know that they broke up. They're no longer together. I don't know if he performs anymore. I'm not sure what he does. I haven't heard anything from him. But there again, I think he had his own style too. Dolores O'Riordan, who we lost not too long ago, that was a very unique voice. She's in that category. No one sounded like her. In fact, it's Dolores O'Riordan when you hear them singing. Very, again, fit the band, and she had so much range, right? If you listen to songs like Salvation and Zombie, um, I'm trying to think of the other title of that song. That song from that movie, was it Boys on the Side? I think it was. I forgot the name of that song, but vocal range, um, played the guitar, so she had that there. She could play an instrument. I'm sure, or I'm taking a guess. I'm not sure if she had a hand in writing a lot of the music. Um, and again, another female lead singer, right? An innovator for the time. Liam Gallagher. It's funny. I never really appreciated Oasis too much. I liked a couple of their songs, of course, the obvious, you know, that they had their greatest hits there. Um, what was it? Don't Look Back in Anger is one of my favorite songs by them. Listen, there are people that consider them to be the biggest thing of the '90s, and I don't agree with that. Of course, I know they felt they were better than the Beatles, right? Wasn't that the rumor or the thing? He said that they're better than the Beatles, which we all know is total bullshit. And they've gotten a bad name, obviously, because of him and his brother not getting along, whatever the case may be. Uh, Good and unique voice. Definitely a good and unique voice. I think he can play an instrument. Not sure. I'm sure he had a hand in writing the music as a showman. I never really saw him as somebody who could dance around and change outfits and everything. Adam Derwitz, Counting Crows, an extremely underrated talent. One of the best voices of the '90s, hands down. If you listen to August and Everything After from first song to the last, you appreciate them so much as a band because it's by far one of the best albums of the '90s. It's in the top 10, in my opinion. I've heard them sing live on the radio, and he sounds amazing. I never had the privilege to see them live, but he had a phenomenal voice. I'm not sure if he can play an instrument, but another guy, very autistic, very hands-on in the overall creation of the music and the image of the band. Um, Longevity, they're still playing, they still perform, they've lasted the test of time. As much as a front man, I don't think he was like one of those outfit changing type guys. But there are people who feel he was the greatest. Phil Anselmo, I know someone had said in some of the comments that they thought he was the best. Again, very unique voice for the time. Voice that fit the band perfectly. Um, Unfortunately, the longevity they crossed over right from the '80s to the '90s, and then they dissolved unfortunately because they were a tight unit together. Pantera. They were definitely a tight unit, and in that amount of time they were together, they did a lot of damage, man. They had a lot of hits, and again, I think his voice, similar to Zach De La Rocha, in that had a lot of aggression, a lot of anger, a lot of primitive in it, which made the music so much better. I don't know if he could play an instrument. I'm not really sure. I know he was very hands on when it came to the production of the music and the type of music. So I think he had his own production company after that, and then he had another band. Um, Not really 100% sure. I don't know what he's doing right now. I think he's still performing, but as a solo act and with a different backup band. I could be wrong. Uh, I said Bono before, and again, Bono goes into the Steven Tyler. Bono goes into the Metallica Axl Rose area because longevity and crossing over. U2 was huge in the 80s. They crossed over into the 90s, had a lot of luck there. And longevity, they're still playing together. I don't personally, I'm not a huge fan of their most present work. I liked a lot of their earlier stuff, but Bono was in those categories. Don't know if he can play an instrument. Vocal talent, yeah, he had a great voice. There wasn't a voice like Bono. It was very 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 melodic, you know. Um Again, definitely fit the band for what it was. When we've heard them in more recent times, and I'll say a couple years ago, they've obviously changed what they were, which a lot of groups do, and either it works or it doesn't, and the voice changes with it. His voice kind of changed too, but they're still relevant. Perry Farrell from Porno for Pyros and Jane's Addiction. Jane's Addiction was a huge band in the 90s. And obviously they weren't around too long, but they had a good amount of hits. He had a very unique high pitched voice, right? Even in Porno for Pyros, and not sure if he could. I think he was instrumental. Not 100% sure. Very autistic, a very autistic lead singer without a doubt. Uh, Total frontman. Dancing, had a lot of style. Remember, we used to perform shirtless. I think he still is. He's like 60 and he's shredded. Looks good. Does not look his age whatsoever. Um, Very intelligent guy. I've seen him speak. I heard him speak a couple times in interviews and whatnot. He's an extremely intelligent guy, so he's in that category. Very, very autistic. Very, very well spoken. Jonathan Davis, unique voice for the time being. Korn had a wonderful sound. Again, I think he goes into the category with Phil Anselmo and Zach De La Rocha. Lots of aggression, lots of anger, lots of like fire, which is always a good thing. You felt it, you know. I think he had a big hand in the music being written. Um, Not sure if he can play a musical instrument. I saw them. No, I never saw them perform, but I've seen videos of them perform early on. He was, very into the music, dancing around with it. Not really like changing outfits and all that stuff. Korn is still around, to my knowledge. I don't know if they're still performing. Obviously, they're not as much as they were during this whole COVID thing. I don't think anybody is. Um, but I think, and I could be wrong, the original roots of Korn are still there. I could be wrong with them, but they had, people loved Korn. Absolutely adored them. Gavin Rosedale, unique voice. Never heard anything like Gavin Rosedale. Kind of a raspy voice in a sense. When they came on the scene, again, perfect voice and sound for that time being. And they had so many hits, Bush. So many hits. Um, the guy was eye candy. The girls loved him. He had that. That's another thing. I guess we can consider that. Although I don't want to bring aesthetics into it because aesthetics are just sometimes a throwaway because what one person thinks is attractive, another person is not. But the chicks definitely dug Gavin Rosedale. Um, just look who his ex-wife was, right? Could play the guitar, had a hand in writing the music. As far as being a frontman dancing and changing outfits, I don't think they had that. Longevity, Bush is still playing together. They were playing together not too long, a couple of years back. They were at the Paramount out in Huntington, Long Island. I did not get a chance to see it, although I heard the show was phenomenal. I think that was a plane that just went by. But, Gavin Rosedale is one of those voices too. People loved him. Ed Roland is a voice and a group that I think is so underrated in Collective Soul. Very unique sound. He had very unique sound. They had collectively, go figure, collective soul, they were amazing. Longevity is in there because they're still performing. Very good guitar player, had a huge hand in the band and writing the music and the production of the music. Again, very artistic, very hands-on, very Billy Corrigan like. And you have to appreciate them because they had so many good hits. Um, and they've lasted a long amount of time, right? From the 90s all the way till now. Still going, still pumping out good content, and probably put out some of the most memorable songs of the 90s. I mean, Shine. When you talk about, Shine from their first album, uh, I think that's one of the many songs I want to say that is on the Standards 90s music list. I can't, I don't think I could go and think of the 90s or listen to a 90s playlist without that song being on it. That's how timeless it is. And then of course, so many of the songs that they had. Great voice. Ed Roland, great voice. Lemmy from Motorhead. Again, fills various different categories. Longevity, definitely, without a doubt. Crosses over into, from the 70s and the 80s into the 90s and up. He's in there playing the guitar, right? Had his own, again, a voice like no one sounds like Lemmy. No one sounds like Lemmy. I think in terms of vocals, Lemmy and Peter Steele kind of have a lot in common in that there is no one on this planet that sounds like them. Same thing with Maynard James Keenan. There's no one that sounds like either of them. They and Lane Staley for that matter. Lemmy's voice, oh man, it sounded exactly like he kind of lived, like that hard living, hard performing. He was a total rock star. He lived that shit off stage and on stage. There was no let's perform. Now who's is the guy on the stage just a performer? When he gets off stage, he's the tennis player. No, Lemmy exactly probably most likely was exactly what you saw. And there is such a respect for that. A voice like no other. He fits various different categories, man. And if you've never seen that wonderful documentary about him, I think it's called Lemmy. You can watch it on YouTube. Phenomenal, phenomenal. You learn so much from that. And the more you listen to Motorhead, the more you appreciate them. Because if you've ever heard their own work, it's amazing. Their covers are amazing. I think that they do one of the best covers in Metallica's Enter Sandman. In fact, I'll say this. I'll go. I don't want to get attacked for saying this from like Metallica fans, and I'm not going to say that their version is better than Metallica, but I will say this: their version of Enter Sandman, as a song set aside and alone, is probably just as good as the original or good on its own, if that makes any sense. And Lemmy had his own style, man. I think what you saw was what you got, which was great. And here's another person we have to put into various categories. Ozzy Osbourne. I mean, let's face it. Is there no one more unique than Ozzy Osbourne? Is there no one who has lasted the test of time more than Ozzy Osbourne? Is there no one who has crossed over into so many different, I mean, from the late 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, and now he's still kicking ass. Was he 73 years old? Still going. Ozzy, I don't think ever played an instrument. Definitely had a big hand. I mean, let's face it, he had a great band behind him too. Um, but again, as a front man, I saw Ozzy perform, I want to say 3 or 4 times. Sounded on point, tight, as good as he ever could every single time. Into it, crowd pleaser, performer jumping up and down, throwing buckets of water at people. Of course, I think that has changed with his as he's aged, and of course, he's had some unfortunate issues. But he's in all those different categories. Unique voice like no other, fit exactly what Black Sabbath was. And I'm going to say this. There's only one Black Sabbath, and that's with Ozzy Osbourne. Okay, I'm sorry. There's only one Black Sabbath I know, and Ozzy Osbourne's the lead singer of that group. Okay, so but even as a solo artist, or even as a without a Black Sabbath, he had a ton of hits. His voice was always unique, always on point. He's in the longevity range. He crosses over, and keeps on going. And a guy who's been has used his name to only generate a lot more positive for himself. Whether it was the late great Ozfests, which I miss so much. I'm not a reality TV person, but one of the best reality TV series of all time, with the Osbournes. Been in movies, so total package type of guy. Sully Erna, okay, very underrated, phenomenal voice, very. I put him in the category with kind of like Zach De La Roca and um, Phil Anselmo, and that. A lot of aggression, a lot of fire, a lot of meaning, a lot of belief in the lyrics that he's singing, a lot of experience. You could feel what he's singing. You can tell that it comes from a true place, or something that they're passionate about. He's passionate about, I should say. Uh, very, very. I saw him live at Jones Beach once. It was him and Rob Zombie, and he actually was. I saw him start off obviously playing the guitar, and then I saw him play the drums, and he kicked ass at both. So very, very musically tight. Can play instruments. Had a big hand in writing the music. Um, it wasn't a guy who was going to change outfits and all that stuff, but um, they're still going. Godsmack is still going. They found a lot of fame at the end of the '90s with their first album, tremendous album, and they've been going ever since. Speaking of Rob Zombie, one of my favorites, Rob Zombie. If you've never seen Rob Zombie live, you must. I once told someone seeing Rob Zombie live is kind of like watching a horror movie live, because the wonderful thing about seeing him live, other than great voice, talk about energy and showmanship, man. I never saw a guy dance around that stage like he did, like a madman. Jumped into the stage. I'm sorry, into the crowd. Walked all the way around the crowd with a huge spotlight. Got back on. Had all these funky and crazy things coming out on stage. One of the things I remember most about him is that I saw his show at Jones Beach. What I loved the most, he had zombie, sexy, hot cheerleaders during the show, which was amazing. And this is before his version of the Halloween movies came out. He came out dressed as Michael Myers during the show. He also had all these huge, funky monsters come out on stage, these giant things. The background was kind of old posters from classic horror movies such as Frankenstein and all types of stuff. It was such a great show, man. It's such a great show. He's in so many different categories. Obviously, longevity, because they've gone from the White Zombie. They started off in, and then um, they disbanded, and then he made it big into the late '90s with his own band, which is a phenomenal band, by the way, all the way up until now. Showmanship, again, like I said, the outfits, the dancing, the whole atmosphere of what he brought, very, very cerebral and intelligent. If you've ever heard an interview with a guy, and very autistic, uh, who represents all those things, Rob Zombie's one of them. I've heard him interviewed various times, whether it was on Joe Rogan, Howard Stern, so many places. I mean, he knows exactly what's going on. Very in tune with his music, very in tune in the writing and the production of it. I don't think he plays an instrument, but man, he fills a lot of categories. Total front man. Total front man. One of the best lead singers of all in this category, I think, and then some. Tom York from Radiohead, right? Unique voice. There's no voice like Tom York, let's face it. Um, Fit the band perfectly. They created a sound that there never really was. I've never seen Radiohead live, but I heard that it's an experience. Um, I think he can also play the guitar. He's seen interviews with him. Very cerebral guy, and they're still together, still going the test of time. Marilyn Manson, okay, again, a voice filled with a lot of aggression, a lot of fire, a lot of meaning behind it. Um, I think that I should say, created something at the time. I don't want to say the word fad, but a style that really caught on. I saw him live twice. Sounded fine live. Longevity, right there. He's still going. Um, I've never seen him play an instrument. Obviously, he can write. He writes the music, or some of the music, or most of the music, whatever. But you hear him speak. Very intelligent guy, very autistic guy, right? Um, I know he's in some type of trouble. I don't follow these things. I know it's something to do with sexual harassment. I don't know. Again, I never try and talk about what I don't know. I don't know it in depth enough to talk about, but I know it's there. But in terms of just music and stuff like that, longevity. When I saw him perform, he came out on stilts. He came out in in different costumes. I mean, it was a whole show, obviously. So he's got that going on. So who was the greatest lead singer from the 90s? Again, I don't think there's an answer for this, because like basketball, like football, when we look for the greatest of anything, we have to consider how what they're involved in has changed. Music has changed so much from the 90s to now. It's not even funny. That's why I think those that have the longevity that are still performing today, whether it's Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses, James Hetfield from Metallica, Maynard James Keenan from Tool, Fire, Perfect Circle, Rob Zombie, Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, um, all these guys that have lasted the test of time. It's so important that they're still around, because they are, thank God, what's left of that time. It's very much like the singers of the 60s that are still around, hopefully. So we have to examine all these categories of who was the greatest. And again, we have to, I think the smartest answer is, I don't think there is an answer, because of all the different moving parts that this has. Like we said, how much music has changed, how much how many different things these lead singers have about them, how many of them can play an instrument, how many of them have a hand in creating the music, writing the music, how many of them have a hand in the production of the music, putting and placing musicians around together, adding on things, how many of them have a hand in the showmanship of the show itself, whether it's dancing, how many of them are dancers and singers and change costumes, how many of them interact with their fans, how many of them have crossed over from different times, how many of them have longevity, how many of them have that vocal range, how many of them have a unique style and voice. It is such a hard question to answer. And the wonderful thing about it is everybody is going to have their opinion. That's what I love about it. That being said, I think that we can appreciate the fact that there are a good amount of lead singers that we can put above others. And I say that not shunning the ones who may not be higher on the list. Because let's face it, the thing about the music industry is that there are bands that have put out album after album, have hit after hit, and have lasted the lasted forever. Hence, be the Rolling Stones. But then there are bands that weren't together that long and had a huge amount of catalog of hits in a short amount of time. And then there are bands or singers that weren't that were around maybe for a split second, but yet, had such an impact. I don't think it's a question that can be answered. I think it's something that has to be pondered, that has to be looked at correctively, objectively, and collectively. And we have to consider all the different categories. Because again, if I relate it to basketball, let's just say out of Kobe, LeBron, Jordan, Magic, and Bird, who was the best defensive player out of them? Okay, we'll take that. Who was the best shooter out of them? Another category. Who was the best ball handler, the best passer? Who was the best leader? Who was a player that made players better around him? Who was more of a clutch player? Again, all these categories. Also, too, how much has the game changed from when these players have played? Something else to consider. Let's say, for argument's sake, you know how it is in sports. You always say to yourself, how would Tom Brady do in the 1980s and the 90s when you could just devour a quarterback and hit him in the knees and smash him with a headshot? How would he do then? Would he hold up? Well, how would a lot of these singers and musicians hold up, in the day before the technology of music, what it is today? Or, and the fine thing about it is that all the lead singers we mentioned, and there's a shitload more that we didn't mention, that I didn't mention rather. All the people I mentioned today, one of the things that they have in common is that they all performed at a time when the technology was either a certain way or was changing. I mean, think about the technology and the times that changed when guys like Ozzy Osbourne, Steven Tyler, Lemmy, because they came from the late 60s, early 70s into the 80s. They're like the forefathers and the oldest out of all this group. Think about all the changes that they saw in music as a whole up until now. Think about the technology that wasn't there that is there now. We have to consider that. So again, I think that this is just one of the most talked about topics we could have in terms of so many different categories. What I would really love to hear more of is people's opinions and why. Why is a certain lead singer your favorite? What is it that you feel makes them the greatest lead singer? Was it their influence on society? Was it what society sought them out to be? Was it their musical ability? Was it their singing ability and singing style? Was it the longevity they had? Was it the way they were able to transcend and cross over through different times? Was it the the showmanship of them, the dancing and singing and the energetic performance they gave? Was it the total appreciation for music as an art, or perhaps the cerebral function they had in terms of music, whether it's writing, whether it's putting out music for other artists? What is it? I really want to hear from others, more of their opinion. And this is a topic that doesn't end, it just keeps on going. So I hope you enjoyed this show. Hopefully another episode will be coming at you next week. Be chronicling something. We'll be covering, I should say, something different. But one thing is for sure, it all has to do with there goes another car. It all has to do with the wonderful and amazing music of the 90s, which will never be duplicated and is heavily missed. Thanks for listening. Peace.